I think many formal leaders take time to reflect on decision making, short term and long term, and I think they spend a lot of time thinking about resources and strategic initiatives and deadlines. I don't think they spend quite as much time or energy thinking about their communication. Yeah, I get it. We're not all as in love with communication as I am. But here's the thing, my friends. If you really want to connect with each of your employees and your peers, you have to, because communication is the link between leadership and power. Hello, and welcome to the Communicative Leader, hosted by me, Dr. Leah O'Million-Hodges. My friends call me Dr. O. I'm a professor of communication and a leadership communication expert. On the Communicative Leader, we're working to make your work life what you want it to be. I want to return to some imagery we discussed earlier last season, that of a hammer. A hammer on its own is neither positive nor negative. We can think of some really positive outcomes of using a hammer. Helping with an organization like Habitat for Humanity, or hanging a photo to make your space warmer and more comfortable. But we can also think about how a hammer can be used in a completely different way, one that results in harm to self or others. Point here, power on its own is not necessarily a dirty word, though with continued and recent abuses of power that dominate headlines and often dictate our daily conversations, it can be really hard not to see it this way. But outside of that, we can think of power as the ability to influence. When we see it this way, it's easier to see the intrinsic link to leadership. So here's the thing, my friends. You can have power without leadership, but not the other way around. Leadership does not exist without power. So first, power without leadership. This one's pretty easy to see. Let's say I go into a bank and I want to demand money. In the past, I may have used a traditional bank robbery example, but considering how tragically commonplace gun violence has been as of late, we're going to go a different route. We're still going into a bank and demanding money, but we're going to do it with a karaoke machine and an air horn. Yes, hang with me. I get into the lobby and I demand money, not just my money, all the money. I can demand attention and I can get that attention. An air horn is loud, my friends. What else? You can drive just about anyone crazy with a karaoke machine. I promise you, my children have one. But if we think about this, I can do a lot of damage to normal operations with an air horn and a microphone, especially if I refuse to leave until forcibly removed. Is someone likely to give me money? Not likely. But if it's one teller or two tellers and I'm blowing the air horn near them and behaving erratically, I might actually succeed in that goal. I can also deter other customers from coming in, likely succeed in getting others to leave and garnering all of the attention. Am I in charge? Am I exercising power? Heck yes. Am I leading? Definitely not. Now the flip side. You can't have leadership without power. Now this can be a really charged topic, and I've had many a leader tell me that they don't use power. And I think it's fair to interpret these statements as I don't abuse power. But to say you don't use power is to say that you don't influence yourself or influence others. Now let's think about something like willpower. The idea that you can will yourself to do something. Get up early, exercise, go to bed at a reasonable time, get that project done. Or we have the personal strength not to do something. Avoid hitting the snooze button, not smoking, not engaging in self put-downs. I usually use the willpower angle to help those who are a little nervous with the word power to understand again, power is not a dirty word, but rather the way we think about influencing ourselves and influencing others. So after that short detour, leadership and power. Leaders have formal power. You can hire employees, allocate bonuses as you see fit, put employees on improvement or behavior plans, or terminate the position. Leaders can assign projects. Some are more visible, more exciting, more desirable, and others, not so much. What about informal power? Leaders can mentor, they can provide feedback, training opportunities that can help someone's career. They can also praise an employee, helping to encourage them at even higher levels of success. What else? The way a leader interacts with a particular employee also impacts the way that others see them. Are they high status? Are they trusted? Are they someone in the know? Or are they on the fringe, someone we interact with when we have to? Again, leaders have a lot of power, both formal and informal. So today we're going to consider 5 traditional sources of position power. We're going to look at some examples, and we're going to talk about how knowing these sources of power can help you better connect with employees than you do right now. But before we look at these sources of position power, I think it's really important that we quickly chat about power distance. So power distance considers how power can be distributed in an organization. We also think about this in terms of culture. When we have high power distant cultures, leaders are regarded with more power and authority, and followers are kind of expected to follow those orders without challenging them. This also means that these employees are less likely to be consulted in decision making, and a lot of times organizations are going to have stricter policies. We also have low power distance cultures. Here, employees are much more likely to challenge a leader's decision, and we're less likely to see inequality because of position or status, because again, we feel comfortable asking questions or asserting our own autonomy. Cultures like Western Europe, New Zealand, the United States, right? I, me, my, we have low power distance, right? We are much more likely to raise a hand or to offer a suggestion or a critique. But if we're looking at cultures like Russia, like China, Taiwan, Mexico, Venezuela, they're considered to have a higher power distance. Considering this, it's also not surprising that authoritarian leadership styles emphasize high power distance relationship. Also, in high power distance cultures, a lot of times employees report experiencing lower job satisfaction and performance, again, because their voice many times is not only not heard, but they are implicitly or explicitly told not to share that voice. So now that we have a little bit of knowledge about power distance and how this works in different cultural settings, I want us to dive into these sources of power and think about what this looks like. So we're thinking back to French and Raven. These are 2 social psychologists. They gave us these sources of powers back in the 50s. They later added a 6th power source, informational. That one's not as routinely integrated as the original 5 are. We're going to talk about it because what I see a lot in my own research is that many a hurt feeling or the first crack in a leader-member relationship stems from feeling like someone is abusing information. Usually an employee feeling like their leader is withholding it, but it can also be a leader upset a member sharing too much of what's going on in a department. So our 5 sources of position power, again, in addition to informational, are legitimate, reward, coercive, expert, and referent. We're going to walk through each of these. We're going to talk about the source of position power. And then we're going to look at it from the leader's perspective, what this looks like, what it sounds like. We're also going to look at this from the follower perspective. Because remember, my friends, we spend more time in the role of a follower than we do as a leader. And also as a follower, we have a lot more power than a lot of times we tend to remember. Well, legitimate power. This is an easy one to grasp, especially if you have a trying relationship with your manager. Legitimate power is imbued in the position, the role, the title, not the person in the role. If you've watched the Band of Brothers series, this is akin to the saying, we salute the rank, not the man. Essentially, you don't have to like the person in the formal authority position, but because they are in that position, they have additional power and autonomy over the group. Short-term, long-term decision-making. With that, the power to shape what the group looks like, where it is headed, and of course, the way it feels for the people in it. What does this look like most often? It means that even when we dislike or disagree with our leader, we're still going to support them and help them to carry out their efforts. Why? They're the ranking member. They're the ones with the legitimate power bestowed by the organization. The other thing here, my friends, organizations are often structured around legitimate power. Why? Because it provides us that scaffolding, a clear reporting structure, and it can be incorporated organization-wide. In short, legitimate power helps organizations, large and small, many times by giving them clarity and structure. So there are some clear benefits to this power source, but again, relying on legitimate power becomes less and less effective over time. It can also prompt lower task performance and satisfaction among your followers. Why? Because it doesn't feel good or incredibly empowering to continue to hear your manager say something to the effect of, well, because I said so, right? So some formal leader tips here. Yes, you have the authority. This is part of your role and your responsibility. However, relying primarily on this power source, it can damage your leader-member relationships and cause others to lose respect for you. As long as you're in the position, the legitimate power remains, so you don't have to fear losing it. I caution far more against abusing this power and losing your team's trust and respect. Knowing that position power isn't going anywhere, and that ultimately you're responsible for the decision, the outcome, or the project, it should free you to consider how to create a work group that you'd want to be a part of. Engaging employees in discussion, seeking their opinions, asking them to consider what possible unintended consequences of decisions may be. Ask them how to make things better, whether that is the group in team meetings or a client-facing project. Employees, this can be a tough one to be on the receiving end of, especially if we feel like our voice doesn't matter. Because when we feel like our voice doesn't matter, oftentimes we stop using it. Followers, you have power too. You have the ability to challenge, to question, to suggest. As I write this, the Supreme Court is meeting to debate President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan. While the Supreme Court are not followers in the traditional sense here, it goes to show that even the highest leader in the United States and arguably the world is being held to a system of checks and balances, being questioned. His power is legitimate, but it doesn't mean that it is all-encompassing or that it can go without check. I want you to think about the legitimacy of your role as well. Your expertise, your training, your know-how. There are no formal leaders without followers. Really, really simply put, they need you. Now we're going to shift and look at reward power. Whereas legitimate power stems from a particular role, reward power isn't necessarily tied to an organizational title, though formal leaders are often positioned to offer the most attractive rewards, right? So as the name suggests, reward power describes the ability to use desired items to influence others' behavior. Enacting this source of power can help a leader quickly motivate employees for a short-term performance boost, or as a means to focus attention on a specific set of group priorities. On the surface, reward power can seem like a win-win. However, there's some drawbacks that I want us to consider. 1, followers, they're not all going to respond to the same reward the same way. One employee may value a $100 gift card after a trying event or project, whereas another might feel offended and would have rather received a handwritten thank you card. When I think of the source of power, I'm reminded of a time I worked in industry in a PR and marketing team, and our hospital was transitioning to electronic medical records. Huge undertaking. And during this event, my colleagues and I worked 29 hours straight during a weekend to applaud units when their records went live and to help keep morale high. I arrived around 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and I left around noon on Sunday. And then we were expected to be in as usual on Monday. And since we were salaried workers, we were given no additional compensation for our efforts. Well, on the surface, I get it. This sounds pretty crummy. We actually felt a lot of pride and a lot of unity as a team. When you work in communication and marketing, PR, events, you're often the first to arrive and last to leave. It's a lot of behind the scenes stuff, but it's also stuff you can feel really good about. Your materials help others to understand the importance of their efforts, or you help to celebrate them for what they do for others. We worked really hard and for a really long time, and we felt great about it. We didn't expect anything in return, but felt pleasantly surprised on Monday when our manager told us the CEO and some other C-suite members were stopping by with a special thank you because of our hard work. Do you know what they brought us? Was it some extra paid time off, some PTO, bagels, coffee, gift cards? Nope. Do you want to know what it was? It was a set of leftover t-shirts from the weekend event. The t-shirts we were all required to wear for 29 hours straight. The t-shirts that we already owned. And also the t-shirts that we, as a team, had designed. The same dang t-shirts that were sitting in a pile in our office because we already had extra. It has been a while since I told that story. And I feel like a little part of me dies each time. But kidding aside, talk about reward power missing the mark. As I mentioned, we were already happy. We were happy with our role in the successful outcome. A group thank you email would have been a cherry on top. But old shirts that we already own and we designed, again, a little death. But that's something to keep in mind. Reward power can be in the form of praise, acknowledgement, positive attention. Think of recognizing people for their mission moments when their work is exemplifying what the organization stands for. Think Employee of the Month or annual company-wide awards. Certainly think on the smaller scale too. Think about how much a well done or I noticed how hard you've been working means. A quick email, a post-it note on their desk, a handwritten card. Small gestures that are often seen as more meaningful than a breakfast, a coffee, or a gift card. One other thing I want you to consider is that over time, rewards, one, they're going to cost you financially, right? But they can also become a primary or sole motivator for employee contribution. Employees of all ranks, how does reward power apply to you? You have the ability to recognize others for their work. Our good old say it, see it technique that we've talked about a lot on the Communicative Leader. Want to learn more from a peer? Maybe how to use a particular software and you know it'll take a while, an hour or longer? Bring them a coffee or tea. Send them a thank you afterwards. I'm a firm believer that small gestures go a long way. So whereas reward power addresses the ability to bestow desired items to followers, coercive power describes a leader's ability to administer punishment. Certainly this can align with the use of legitimate power, but it can also go a step further. While legitimate power may include a leader's ability to document issues in an employee's file or reduce their salary or downgrade a follower's title, coercive power can also include punishment, like excluding a team member from certain information or choice projects, or even engaging in the silent treatment. Coercive power often leads to quick follower obedience, of course, right? And this might be the right choice if an employee's behavior requires disciplinary action. Is this also a common approach that's used in high turnover industries if we're thinking about the food industry or retail, for example? Why? Because it helps a manager to set clear expectations and achieve quick results. Of course, there are some costs associated with this use of coercive power or the predominant use of coercive power. It drains your physical and emotional energy, right? It can also lead to lower follower task satisfaction and a negative workgroup culture that lacks trust and commitment. At this moment in my life, as a parent to young children, I think about coercive power a lot. I'm just going to be honest with you, friends. It takes a lot more energy, for me at least, to think about alternative ways to get my kids to take belongings upstairs, for example, or to clean their room than coercive power. And certainly this is not my first approach, right, by any means. So I start with this kind, gentle reminder, something like, hey, sweets, when you have a moment, could you please take your books to your room? Then we move to a few more direct requests, to then talking about consequences. So then all of a sudden it's like, those books will be mine if they are not in your room in -3 seconds. Yeah. I know -3 seconds isn't a thing, but come on, being a parent can make you feel crazy. But here's the thing. Even when I resort to coercive or punishment power, I don't like the sound of it coming out of my mouth. I don't like how it feels. I know it's not the best move for relationships I share with my kiddos, but we're human and it happens. So why am I sharing this example? Because while coercive power can be effective in generating action, again, it can come at a cost for everyone. Like I mentioned before, it can be draining to communicate this way. It creates walls, or it can strengthen walls that are already there. And again, it's not fun to be on either side of this source of power. I'm not saying that we shouldn't or can't use it. I'm just saying, like all things, it is context specific and audience specific. My entitled leaders, my informal leaders, my friends, how and where do we see this use tactic? Common way, strikes, or otherwise withholding our efforts. Sometimes it may feel like this is the only way to be heard or have our needs seriously considered. Now we're moving on to our fourth source of position power, expert power. So titled leaders who possess specialized knowledge and experience in the area they lead in, they can also enact expert power. But unlike the forms of power we've already discussed, expert power resides in the individual, not in the position. While it may seem like a no-brainer that a leader would have experience in the area they work in, I think it's important we acknowledge how often CEOs jump between industries. So use of expert power leads to high follower task satisfaction and performance, and it requires very little extra work or emotional or physical drain on the part of the leader. Expert power, it takes time and dedication to develop, but again, this is something that is within the person. That's something I want you to consider is if we don't have other role-based sources of power, right? Reward, legitimate, coercive, we might not get the results we want only with our expertise. But what I do want to leave you with in thinking about expert power, this one is awesome for everyone. Again, it is not in a position, it is in you, your ability to problem solve, to add alternatives, to orient others, to teach others, whatever it may be. This one stems from your unique skills, abilities, and experiences. As we've said before, in the immortal words of Dr. Seuss, no one is youer than you. Now, our fifth source of power also resides in the person rather than in the formal titled position, referent power. Individuals who have referent power are often charismatic. Others want to listen to them, hear their thoughts and their opinions. Individuals with referent power can be really influential just because of those feelings of affection and esteem and respect that they tend to inspire in others. This is the person that everyone just tends to like, the person they trust and they go to. When I think of referent power, I think of Paul Rudd. Yes, Ant-Man. No one tends to say a bad thing about him. He seems so likable. Another celebrity often cited with referent power, Oprah. So many listen to Oprah that if she endorses your product, you better be ready to be inundated with orders. Well, this sounds pretty amazing at first. It can also be just about impossible if you don't already have the infrastructure in place to instantaneously scale up. The Oprah effect refers to her far-reaching influence stemming from this authenticity. She's often noted for helping individuals move from successful practitioners to household names, right? People like Nate Berkus, Dr. Oz, Dr. Phil, and Rachel Ray. What else is really neat about referent power? Again, we don't need a formal titled leadership position. Sometimes one of the leader's trusted advisors becomes the face of the department or a proxy for that titled leader. Here's a few things. There are a few challenges with referent power that we need to consider. So one, if we're using charisma, we need to make sure that we're actually able to walk the walk, that what we are suggesting and offering is truly an option. And then certainly the far end of charisma can be a really scary thing. Charisma can be intoxicating, especially when it's combined with love bombing. These are two ingredients that we often see in abusive romantic relationships and yes, far end of the spectrum, but cult leaders as well. That's an episode for another day, but it's important for us to separate the request from the requester, especially when we see that person as highly interpersonally attractive. Their charisma, their charm. Well, if someone else asked us the same thing, would we say yes? This form of power is hard to give tips on, aside from those that are more defensive in nature, like we mentioned. How do you develop referent power? Being authentic, being who you are, leaning into your own interpersonal strengths, not trying to portray someone or something that you're not. So we've discussed the 5 sources of power, right? Legitimate, reward, coercive, expert, and referent. And these are the most discussed and applied. But again, as I mentioned, after publishing these 5 sources, French and Raven came back and they added one more to this list, informational. So they suggest that this base of power is, powerful because if someone has greater access to information, such as our titled leaders, or when someone has specific information that we're in need of, right, they are in a position of power. This is part of why being a formal leader comes with so much responsibility and so much pressure. It can be very, very hard to toggle between wanting to be transparent with your employees, but holding on to information that will impact them and not being able to share it quite yet. Information can be power, but it can also be a burden. One thing I appreciate that French and Raven discuss regarding informational power is how strategic we can be with disclosing it, either directly or indirectly. So formal leaders, you often take the direct route, and this makes sense because you have legitimate power, part and parcel with your role. If something isn't done correctly, you can just ask an employee to fix it. But another way we see informational power used is indirectly. And oftentimes those in member or non-formal leader roles will take this approach. Why? Less social cost. Something we've talked about before, but essentially it costs us more to ask a leader the same question over and over than our peer. Why? Well, our peer doesn't do our performance review. But again, back to employing informational power in an indirect manner. French and Raven give the example of a nurse working with a doctor. Might be more effective for the nurse to share their casual observations or engage in a strategic discussion about best practices meant to be overheard, rather than directly questioning the attending physician. Taking the time to reflect on the 5 sources of power is helpful for leaders and members. As a leader, reviewing the power sources provides some insight into how leaders attempt to inspire, relate to, and align followers. Suppose you, a formal leader, you realize that you're primarily using coercive power. Reflecting on this tendency allows you to consider why this has become your go-to communicative approach. And to say, hey, is this still useful? Is this still doing what I started out and hoping it would achieve? I also encourage all formal leaders to engage in a personal communication audit to consider what approach or approaches would motivate their followers better and engineer their preferred work culture. Take time to recognize how you interact with each employee. Do some find themselves receiving more rewards and others more coercive interactions? On the other hand, members, consider your manager's communication as a barometer to understand a situation. For example, suppose your manager tends to use referent power and expert power and reward power, generally speaking, but they approach a particular concern with coercive power. In that case, you can draw some conclusions about the depth of emotion and maybe the pressure the manager feels towards this particular event. So what are we working on this week, my friends? We're going to consider these sources of power and consider when and where and with whom we're using them. Why? Tend to have a couple of go-to approaches. Are we always using a treat or an incentive to get our kids to do something? Do you tend to try to get your way at work by reminding others of your expertise or your title? Taking the time to consider when and how we use these sources of power helps us to better understand our own approach to influence. On the next episode of the Communicative Leader, we are tackling conflict. Yep, it's time, my friends. We hear conflict and we cringe, but conflict can be a really powerful thing and a really positive thing. Intrigued? I hope so, because we're going to dive into that next week. All right, my friends, that wraps up our conversation today. Until next time, communicate with intention and lead with purpose. I'm looking forward to chatting with you again soon on the Communicative Leader.